Just for You by Robert Eastland, read by Hannah Gordon.
Rosie wasn't sure what she thought of the house the first time she saw it. As they drove up the steep driveway that first morning, it towered over them, a dense mass of stone and ivy. They parked on the gravelled area at the front and found lawns to the side, well kept and decked out with garden furniture, then a patio and an orchard, and at the back flower beds rich in August bloom. Rosie still wasn't sure. The deep woods of Brackenthwaite came down virtually to the garden hedge, and they'd driven along the valley from Lakewell for 10 minutes without seeing another car. It was very isolated. Sheila, on the other hand, was enthused. She spent the first 10 minutes at the front, being wowed by the bleak and misty grandeur of Crummock Water. Then the next hour busying around like a bee, even getting Sergeant Cooper to help. He was a big, heavy block of a man, with iron-grey hair and a tough, weathered face, but he was still in awe of Rosie, standing there, hat in hand, constantly telling her what an honour it was to have such a distinguished actress living among them. He even seemed impressed that Sheila was Rosie's agent and willingly helped them move in, taking off his tunic and rolling the sleeves back on his brawny arms. He was certainly a reassuring presence in so remote a place, and perhaps a welcome relief after all those lean, unsmiling, trench-coated men from Scotland Yard. He was certain they'd be comfortable here, he told them repeatedly, as they explored the various rooms of the house. It had always been popular as a holiday home, had this old place. Rosie had to admit it was nicely furnished, even if the upholstery was a little musty, and the central feature, the hall, with its stone-flagged floor, slate hearth and upstairs balcony, was quite magnificent. Now she understood the price tag. It was several hours before they were properly installed, and Sergeant Cooper gallantly withdrew, backtracking across the drive to his Panda car, still smiling and insisting that if they had any problems at all, they could get him at Lakewell Police Station. Just ask for him. Sergeant Cooper, that was. When he had gone, Sheila joined Rosie by the front door and put her arms round her. "Happy?" she asked. Rosie nodded, but the tears in her eyes told otherwise. My God, driven from my own home. Sheila gave her a gentle peck on the cheek. "It'll not be for long, honey. Don't you worry. They'll get him." Rosie smiled bravely and wiped the tears away. At the beginning, it was phone calls in the middle of the night. No deep breathing, just the unearthly silence and the terrible presence of the unseen listener. Fans, the police had told her wearily. Stupid, besotted fans. Even a faded glamour puss could still attract them then, she thought bitterly. But it was some kind of fan who'd suddenly begun to carry out sex murders in her honour, almost like they were sacrifices to her name. "Just for you, my sweet. Just for you." She shuddered every time she recalled those words and that sibilant, whispering voice on the telephone. A natural progression, police psychological profilers had called it. The listening was the stalk. The boasting and gloating on the phone was the catch. What followed next? She'd begun to wonder. The kill, perhaps? One thing was certain. London had quickly become too hot for Rosie Crayford. He'd called her every night he'd murdered. 9 times in 6 months. As she stood before the strange mirror that night in the strange bathroom, she wondered if 38 years had really been so cruel, or was it simply him? Oh, she still had her fulsome figure, her flowing auburn hair and deep green eyes. But how to explain the ashen pallor, the telltale lines of grief and weariness? Sheila joined her, Her hand still covered in rings and bangles, even slippered and nightgowned as she was now. She handed Rosie a large glass of wine. Rosie couldn't help but smile. Late that night, however, the sound of a telephone ringing from somewhere below woke Rosie up. She was halfway downstairs when the terror came back to her. The moment she began screaming, however, the phone stopped ringing. Sheila was beside her in a second, but Rosie could hardly speak. The light was on the stairs and landing, but the darkened pit of the hallway was unexplored territory. Rosie gazed down into it. It was the phone again. I heard the phone. "Honey, you were dreaming," said Sheila patiently. "You must have been. We haven't got a phone." Rosie almost swooned with relief as it came back to her. This was one of the reasons they'd chosen this place. It was cut off. It was a hidden little niche, completely unconnected to that dark and dangerous world of madmen with telephones. She laid her head on Sheila's shoulder. Oh, thank God, thank God. "I've got more good news for you," her agent told her. "Richie's coming up tomorrow." Rosie looked up, delighted. Sheila gave her a big smile. "He left a message down at the village post office. You were in bed when I got back with it. Didn't want to wake you." "Better late than never, I suppose," Rosie said, with the old pout that had once slammed 1,000 box offices. "He's a busy man, hun," Sheila reminded her, "boyfriend or not." Rosie could only agree. She'd sleep easier now. Richie Robinson was over 10 years younger than Rosie, and Sheila didn't approve of him. Early next morning, though, as she drew back the curtains on another glorious day, the calm surface of Crummock Water mirroring the tree-lined shore and a blue sky dotted with bits of fleecy cloud, she was mightily relieved to see him cruising up onto the drive in his Harley-Davidson. Rosie was still asleep upstairs, so Sheila went out to meet him alone. He just dismounted and was taking off his helmet and shaking the blonde locks out over his tasselled black jacket. For once, however, his unspoiled, pretty boy face was grim. Immediately, she knew something was wrong. "Not another one?" she asked tentatively. "Last night," he confirmed. Sheila put a hand to her mouth as he described the familiar state of the woman's body found dumped in the Thames, the recognisable, almost ritualistic mutilations. "Jesus," she whispered. Rosie said she thought she'd heard the phone ringing, but no, that isn't possible. Listen, Richie, she's still pretty strung out. You'd better not tell her." Richie began to unpack his gear. He wouldn't tell her, he said sullenly, but she was bound to read about it in the papers. "We aren't getting the papers," Sheila said decisively, as she led him into the house and through to the kitchen. "Not at the moment." Richie, as usual, not trusting Sheila, wondered what would happen if he phoned again. Sheila insisted that he couldn't. They didn't have a phone. He then wondered if that was safe, all the way out here. "It's her mind I'm worried about at the moment," said Sheila, handing him a mug of coffee. "No one knows we're here." Richie didn't say anything for a moment, but stood by a side window drinking. He was looking out beyond the grounds to the steep and shadowy woods. She knew what he was thinking. He was thinking they'd cooped themselves up, hemmed themselves in. He being an open road man, of course. One of those guys who just couldn't settle down. She almost snorted in contempt. Couldn't grow up, more like. Jesus! Rosie certainly could pick them. He suddenly turned round. "Haven't the Cumbrian police offered any kind of protection like the Met did?" She shrugged and began to clear her breakfast things. "Of course they did. I turned them down." Richie could hardly believe it. With the two of them stuck out in a big old house like this, with probably 100 different ways for somebody to get in. Sheila was determined not to be drawn. "Richie, nobody knows we're here." He began to storm around, slapping his forehead. What if somebody had been watching their every move, he wondered. Followed them up the motorway, even. Sheila was pretty sure nobody had. Pretty sure, eh? Said Richie scornfully. The Lakewell police will be looking in on us, she replied. Wooden tops, he snapped. He took a thickly folded road map out from his pocket and spread it out on the breakfast bar. They had to talk to someone important. Get a proper guard, he said. For a minute or so they scanned the crumpled map, searching for the nearest decent-sized town. Eventually they found it. Carlisle, nearly 40 miles away. Richie looked up at her accusingly. This is some hideaway you've got yourself, Sheila. When Rosie came down later on, Sheila told her that Richie had arrived, but was now off on his bike somewhere seeing the police. She didn't mention that there'd been another murder. They spent the rest of the day reading, playing cards, and walking together through the steep, sun-dappled woods. They never strayed far from the house. Rosie felt naked in the open air these days, and grabbed Sheila's arm at the slightest sound. Sheila herself wondered at how quiet it was. A warm, still afternoon was followed by a typical Lake District storm. As the evening drew down, sultrier by the hour, heavy green thunderheads full to bursting stacked up in the west, dwarfing the rolling summits of Ennerdale and Red Pike. By nightfall, lightning was sparking in the distance, and a torrent of rain falling, flooding from the gutters over the bay windows. They tried to ignore it, and sat down in easy chairs in front of the hearth, reading. Every so often, Sheila would glance up at Rosie. Rosie would smile back, though she flinched at every crack of thunder. Resolutely, however, she always got back to her book. Then, the lights went out. Before she knew what she was doing, Rosie was screaming for Sheila, who scrambled over to her. It's all right, honey, it's all right. It's just a blackout, probably the storm. Flickering badly. The lights came on again. Sheila gave Rosie a cuddle. See? Rosie, however, was shivering violently. God, I wish Richie would hurry up. He's been gone all day. Then the lights went out again, plunging them into utter blackness. Rosie cried out hoarsely. Sheila tried to calm her, insisting that it was only the storm. She couldn't say the same a moment later, when somewhere, close by them, a telephone began to ring. There was a moment of paralysis. Then Rosie leaped to her feet. You said we didn't have a phone, she stammered. You said... Sheila, badly shaken but at least trying to stay level-headed, had also stood up. She looked vainly around in the dark. We can't do anything until the lights come on. Just relax. Rosie's voice had now risen to a wail, however. What if somebody's turned them off? Sheila wondered exactly who could have turned them off. But Rosie's answer turned her blood cold. The same person who doesn't know we're here, she said. Who's ringing us on a phone we don't have. Sheila was about to reply when the lights came on again. The two women looked across the room at each other, both pale as ice. The phone was still ringing out, however, and in the full light, they traced it quickly to the drinks cabinet, to inside the drinks cabinet. Between the bottles and decanters, they found a portable phone. Just as Sheila picked it up, it ceased to ring. They exchanged glances, the same thoughts rushing through both their heads. Neither had brought their phones with them. Richie had one, but it was fixed in his car, and he'd come up on his bike. Somebody's been in here, Rosie breathed. And then, with a crackle of electricity, the lights went out again, this time with an air of permanency. Lightning suddenly split the sky overhead. The rain teemed in the windows. Rosie staggered helplessly across the room as thunder boomed down through the old house. He's here, she sobbed. It was Sheila! For once, Sheila's mouth had gone dry. She couldn't answer. To deny it would simply be to lie. Nobody left portable phones in drinks cabinets. Not without coming back to look for them. And certainly, nobody broke into your house to leave you one. Not without some ulterior motive. There was a sudden, single knock on the front door. It was followed by another, this one much louder. "Richie," Rosie whispered, almost beyond hope. "Richie, is it Richie?" The actress began to scramble towards the door. Sheila was too frozen to stop her. Then there was a third knock, this more a violent blow. It halted Rosie in her tracks. Both the women held their breath. The fourth knock was a resounding crash. Involuntarily, they both screamed. Rosie hurriedly retreated. For seconds, there was silence. Then, from beyond the front door, a crunching of gravel. The sound of huge feet moving slowly away. A brilliant glare of lightning fleetingly threw everything into focus, almost blinding them, but not so that they didn't see the hulking silhouette making its way past the bay window towards the back of the house. Rosie might have shrieked full-bloodedly had Sheila not clamped a warning hand over her mouth. We could use the phone," Sheila hissed. "The one he left us." Rosie nodded dumbly, and as stealthily as they could, they began to look for it. The blackness was complete, however. They crawled and scrabbled and searched, but nowhere could they find it. In their fevered terror, neither could remember where they had left the thing. Rosie was now weeping again, copiously, helplessly, hugging herself, on the verge of a total breakdown. Then she looked quickly up. "Sheila, my God, he's gone round the back of the house. The climbing ivy, Jesus, the bedroom windows are open." Sheila sucked in her breath, her mind racing. Suddenly she burst into action. "I'll close them," she said, scrambling to the stairs and up them. Rosie screamed that she shouldn't, that he might already be up there, but Sheila ignored her. He couldn't be up there, not yet. A big shape like that couldn't squeeze in through those little windows without a struggle. In any case, it had to be the windows. They might dash out to the car, but in this dark she didn't even think she could find the keys. They couldn't leave. The only option was to stay put and keep him out. As she reached the landing, however, and began to feel her way hand over hand along the banister, the front door thundered to the sound of furious knocking. But this was normal knocking, human knocking. The sound of somebody beating frantically on the wood with a fist. And there was a man's voice, too, full of concern. Sheila stopped in her tracks. It sounded like Sergeant Cooper. It was Sergeant Cooper. He was shouting Rosie's name over and over again, asking if she was all right. Legs like rubber, Sheila moved back to the top of the stairs. Down below, she could hear Rosie frantically unchaining the door. As it swung open, fresh air gusted in. The noise of the storm was suddenly amplified. Sergeant Cooper sounded relieved to find them alive. There had been an identical murder just down the valley, he was saying urgently. The killer might be here now. They must get out as quickly as they could. Rosie was too hysterical to make him realise that indeed the killer was there. He put his coat over her head and urged her out into the rain, telling her to get into his car. He turned in the doorway and called Sheila. She was coming, she said, coming. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, though, she could hardly stand. The rain was still lashing down outside, the wind blowing through the house. Sheila knew she was ready to collapse. That was when she heard the explosion of glass and splintering wood somewhere up in the bedroom. She tried to jump up, but couldn't. She was literally paralysed with fear. A scream strangled in her throat. She listened helplessly as a bedroom door crashed open. Then feet came clumping violently along the landing, turned at the top, and came straight down the stairs towards her at terrible speed. As a hand grabbed her shoulder, Sheila fainted. She came to, feeling sick and shivering. Someone was forcing brandy to her lips. She looked weakly up. In the light of several torches, she saw Richie. Relief flooded through her. He wanted to know what the hell had been going on. They'd been hanging on the doorbell for ages and ended up trying to break the door down, then having to force their way in through one of the upstairs windows. Luckily, he'd had some police assistance. Where was Rosie? Sheila looked up at him. Her mind was too numb with shock to say that On a night like this, what the hell did he expect had been going on? To say that of course they hadn't been able to hear the doorbell, the power was off. But most importantly of all, to say that she thought Rosie was with them. He wasn't in a listening mood, however. He was too busy making excuses for being so late. The storm was a nightmare, the district in chaos. But he knew he had to get back quickly. Something Sheila had said about the Lakewell police looking in on them. He'd checked. There were no police at Lakewell, never had been. Sheila's brandy glass dropped to the carpet. Somewhere in that darkened room, the phone began to ring.